today. Thank you for joining us, and I now am honored to welcome RongLu Tang, who is presenting Female Power in Music. Welcome.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for coming to my session. My name is RongLu Tang, and you can call me Rachel if you want it. And I'm now a doctoral candidate in Cincinnati Conservatory of Music, which is under the University of Cincinnati. Since my major is piano performance and literature, so today I will talk about the topic related to my field and my minority identities as Asian and also a musician, and which is female power in music. As we all know, the classical music industry was dominated on a perspective of European and male for centuries. In order to be more representative and inclusive nowadays, we need to invite a diverse of representations to take the music ground. This presentation will introduce two female and Asian-born musicians who devote their talent in Western classical music and being active in the US and globally. With their racial and cultural identity, we will talk about the obstacles they faced as Asian musicians and how they fight their way out as females in the male-dominated industry. So now I'm gonna share the PowerPoint, see if you guys can see it. Let me know if there's any problem with that. So first of all, I'll talk about the identity as Asian and bring out a little bit background of Asian and how we were being educated by our parents and what the society is like. By giving educational purpose to children, Asian parents like to encourage their children learning music since young age. Most of them start with an instrument first, such as piano or a violin around age 4, an age way before they understand the social norm. That might be the reason that musicians think of themselves as musicians first before contemplating their other identities, such as race or ethnicity. Unlike Asian Americans, many Asian musicians are not born in US, but rather arriving in US as teenager or early adult to explore the diverse studying opportunities in musical conservatories. With a great shock for various cultural differences and lack of English language skill, they suffer the stress of adapting the foreign environment and the competitive conservatory settings. Even with high amount of scholarships provided based on their talent, many of the students suffers for the financial stresses due to the different currencies between their country and US. The larger pressure puts on them after the graduation. It is really hard for them, for talented musicians, to get work visa or a green card to remain in US for further career opportunities, even they have the abilities to win the top musical competitions. So let's talk about the stereotype problems that Asian musicians are facing. For the fewer Asian musicians who secure their living in US also face different stereotype lenses based on their identities. The debate of ethnicity in classical music challenges the Asian musicians because of their race, and many critics feel the sense of threat, afraid of outsiders damaging their integrity of the culture. The audience, especially Europeans, emphasize the nature connection to musicians' geographical and historical origin, implies a racial dissonance when it comes to Asian musicians. Even Asian musicians are greatly evaluated by the audience. They're more likely to be praised on skill, on techniques at first place. I'll talk about the female musicians based on what kind of background they have and also what kind of obstacles they faced in and all kind of stereotype problems they faced. So about the background, back in the 90s, the notion of classical music is intrinsic to respectable womanhood. Asian parents tend to steer girls to learn music and invest their future studies in conservatories in order to raise their value in the marriage market. However, in general, the society does not expect females to make a living on music and does not provide serious career guidance for female. Only a small percentage of females have a professional musical career or get advanced educational job in universities. Even though the female ratio in conservatories were far more weighted than males in class. Nowadays, society is changing and females receive more educational opportunities and better guidance on their musical career. However, they are facing different challenges of juggling careers and expectations from the society. Although women comprise nearly half of the US workforce nowadays, they still fulfill a large share of household responsibilities compared to males. As women most often are the ones who adjust their schedules and make compromises when the needs of family members collide with work. It is hard for them to focus on their own advanced academic life and career path, especially in a competitive classical music industry where it requires a consistent investment of time, creativities, and money. So about the issue of stereotype. Even by putting all the efforts in their career paths, the challenges of musical career for women is as tough as the race situations. Since the music industry is pretty much image-oriented when it comes to selling albums and concert tickets, female performers are unlikely to just let the audience focus on their playing, but rather people will market through their physical appearance to stand out of their peers. If the same case applied to male performers, audience would naturally focus more on his playing other than his look. He can be ugly or having a messy hair or wear glasses on stage if he can perform well. But for women, appearance is very important, especially for a rising star if she want to make a living as a concert pianist. On the other hand, when we have the majority of decision-making powers in male's hands, who is most likely to be a conductor or director, female musicians are easily become the targets involving rumors and sexual harassment caused by the gender and power imbalance. So I'm going to talk about a few role models who are professors in universities right now, and I see them as my lighthouse guiding through my journey as a female musician and an Asian musician in US. So about Professor So-Young Lee, she's now the associate professor in Cincinnati Conservatory of Music, and I took several classes he taught, and I really admire her as a pianist, as a musician, and as an educator. She believes the issue of race is very much tied to the issue of gender. According on her interview, she said, "It is really hard for an Asian person, but especially for a woman, to make it in the classical music world. I feel this more and more these days, because our culture teaches us to be polite in a way that it becomes submissive almost. And what we receive as rude behavior is actually sometimes what's necessary to get work done and to make it really work in this area, you know." From the book Musicians from a Different Shore, I found Professor Lee's past interview where she talked about her struggles as Asian female musicians and the bias he had dealt with. I think Americans or the world in general has their perception of Asian women as submissive, and that really bothers me a lot. There are so many Asian women that are doing piano, and we come out with our little ponytails and fluffy dresses, especially the pre-college kids here. I'm not sure that people take us seriously, really. Because so much of the value of what's expected of Asian women is to get married to a rich man and to be a good mother and stay at home. Yes, in recent years, that's rapidly changing, but it's not changed that much. My parents in Seoul are like, you know, your piano is really important, but why don't you just marry a lawyer or doctor around? And I feel like because of this sort of gender ideals shared with among many Asians, even the faculty in Juilliard would automatically think maybe, well, this girl is so talented and great, but she's probably gonna one day get married and not pursue this career. And a lot of people are that way. So in this sense, already, the manager and society don't take us seriously. Some teachers, especially the old-fashioned teachers, really do focus more on guy student. It's really hard to be a woman, a feminine person, and be really strong. People don't really want to accept that or something. I think Asian women have to work really hard to get out of this given situation that we're going to eventually get married and have a home. What Professor Lee pointed out years ago is still our realities as a performer on stage. However, we're glad to see more and more Asian female musicians fight for their way out, winning top competitions and influencing generations of students in universities as professors. So I'm sorry, I didn't click the button to show you the beautiful image of Professor So-Young Lee and about the subsections, what I talked about for her past interviews and her struggles as pianist. So next speaker, I'm going to talk about Professor Chen Yi. She's a brilliant composer in Asian history and also influenced a lot of musicians in US and China. So I'm going to talk about the bio of her. Except Asian performers, women composers also faced with greater pressures while expressing their philosophies. I will present Professor Chen Yi as an example who devoted herself through diverse lenses, including not only gender, but also ethnicity, exotism, and a culture fusion. After introducing her work, let's talk about her original background. Dr. Chen Yi was born on April 4, 1953 in Guangzhou, China. She started violin and piano lessons at age 3, and her 2 siblings are also classical musicians. Drawn on her father's collection of records and orchestral scores, she made rapid progress as a violinist and began to learn solo parts of some of the classical traditional concertos for violin and orchestra, the showpiece compositions for instrument. In 1986, Chen became the first woman in China to receive a master's degree in composition. For the same year, Chen received an offer to study composition with Professor Cho Wen-chon and Professor Maria Davolsky at Columbia University. Earning her DMA, which is a doctoral program in performance and literature in 1993, Chen finished the degree and also received the resident professor resident composer compositions with 3 major San Francisco area institutions. The Women's Philharmonic Orchestra, the Aptos Creative Arts Center, and the Capella Chorus Chanticleer. Later, Chen got a composition job at Peabody Conservatory of Music in Baltimore. Now she's a distinguished professor at the Conservatory of the University of Missouri, Kansas City. She is a recipient of prestigious Charles Ives Living Award from the American Academy of Arts and Letters, and received a bunch of top awards from the composition field. Chen is a profound composer with hundreds of works related to different types of music, including solo, chamber, choral, and orchestra. Frequently praised as a cultural ambassador and a strong advocate of new music, Chen combined the fusion of Asian and Western structure to a significant level in contemporary classical music. There are often folk music, Beijing opera, Chinese speech patterns, and the sounds of Chinese instruments present a stimulus in nearly all of her works, even though the elements were played by Western instruments such as violin, cello, and piano. Sometimes, but rarely, there are Chinese instruments such as zheng, pipa, or erhu that combine with Western instruments that we know as violin and cello to bring out the unique timbre to the piece. So it's really interesting to see her piece have both instruments of China and also Western instruments involved together in her piece. Except multicultural contents, she also inspired by poetry, painting, or narrative, absorbing the essence of other form of art and come up with general concept of her music, then grabs the image and musically and draw down other musical ideas with logical mapping of the sections according to her interview. Chen adapted her life and knowledge into compositions in many ways. She used elements of percussive folk influence style of Hungary composer Bela Bartok, as well as American jazz that she heard on a New York City subway. She even used the sound of Celtic bagpipes in her KC Capriccio after hearing a pipe playing in Kansas City. Chen's percussion concerto, right for the famed deaf Scottish percussionist Evelyn Gillane, showcased her ability to counterpoint Chinese and Western percussion together in her composition. So as a composer, Chen have always spoken her intent of using music as a tool to improve the understanding between peoples in the world. She mentioned in her autobiography book that I hope to help resolve social problems and unnecessary conflict through my music making and teaching. Among hundreds of her compositions, many are given a clear indication of her wishes to address political and social issues. So next, I'm going to talk about 2 works of her. The first one is Ning, is a chamber works she presented in year of 2001. And a 2 and another work she composed for the disaster of 9/11 happened in US. So ning is a mixed trio placed by violin, cello, and pipa, which is a Chinese instrument. Premiered by Yang Nam Kim, Yo-Yo Ma, and Wu Man on May 30th of 2001. The Chinese character Ning, which is the title, is another name of the city Nanjing, which is the south part of China. At that time, Nanjing was the capital of China during the Asian Pacific conflict of World War II. The character is also has another meaning of peaceful and serene. The piece is based on a background of brutal chapter in Chinese history, Nanjing Massacre in 1937. It's massive killing of Chinese civilians and a widespread rape of Chinese women by Japanese soldiers heartbreaks the composer. Chen composed a piece of music for calling the soul back to a resting place and to evoke hope and reconciliation, looking forward to the peace of the world in the future. The music is composed in a dramatic shape, symbolizing the sound of violence and tragic scenes, crying and miserable sobbing, gripping meditation, and elusive fantasy. Performed on a bowing and plucking instrument, combining unique styles and performing techniques in music of East and West in an abstract form and texture. With a reference to famous Chinese song, Jasmine Flow, fragments with heavily modified rhythms and even some pitches with cello playing to start the piece. Even as a Chinese, when I hear that song, that composition she composed, it's kind of hard for me to recognize the tune since the jasmine flow is a flower. Jasmine flower is a really famous folk song in China. Since she adapted in different rhythms and different gestures with cello playing, it's kind of hard for us to recognize the tune. At the end of the composition, we can see Chen move the music from the horrors and violence of the war to a very calm ending, just kind of referencing the victims raise their innocent heart to the heaven and their innocent heart as pure as the jasmine flower. I'll play this music. Let me see. I'll send it to the chat box and giving 5 minutes for everyone to hear that piece after I introduce the background of the music. And maybe we can come back in 5 minutes.
So we have only about 4 minutes left. So maybe we could watch like an excerpt of it and come back.
Okay. Okay, I'll talk about the other issues that I think is quite important for my session, and maybe leaving a link for you guys to explore by yourself. So I'm going to talk about the obstacles that Asian faced with our history and the intercultures that we faced as Asian in US, and how they find their way out as musicians to solve the social racism. During the 16th century, while East and West remained justly different in both cultures and characteristics, those differences in terms of textures and timbres were measured against European standard and ideal music in their mind. According to Western evolution notion of music, Chinese monophonic and heterophonic style still had a long way to go for the complicated and sophisticated culture skill. Those attitudes continue well into the 19th century. Europeans did not understand the musical differences and perceive them as a term of just simply good or bad, beautiful or ugly, those like simple ideas when they are hearing the Chinese music. So after those composers such as Chen Yi and Bryson and Cholom, they study in US and learn a bunch of technique, like a structure of the Western music. They found there's a great influence they had from the Bela Bartok, which is one of the most important Hungarian composers in 20th century. The way they learned from Bela Bartok is they understand the roughness of the folk music is part of its beauty, and they broke down it to 3 sections. One is that you can use a folk melody with accompaniment. The second is that you could write in imitation of folk melody into the folk style. The third is that you don't need to deliberately write in folk music style, but your music come out with the flavor of the folk music. By then you have the spirit of folk music in your blood. So as Asian composers absorb and combining the multi-cultures, the issue of self-identification come up for them as well. Asian composer Tan Dun put it like, in Europe and even Japan, everyone think I'm an American composer, but in America, I'm a Chinese composer. According to a paper, Chinese and the West, that issues of identity and perception often disregarded in the name of creativity, and composers' claim of autonomy are important to discussion of music. There are clues to explain the power of individual agency. At the same time, they allow us to see how composers take advantage of the market, audience expectations. And
we are at our, I just want to give you, this is
okay.
So beautiful.
I'll wrap up by myself.
Continuation. It's a continuation because I'm hoping that you will share some of, as you know, this is recorded, but I hope you share some of the music inside the chat, as well as with our online database and
yes.
Our email list, because it is amazing. Thank you for the visibility you are giving these important artists, and thank you for the visibility within your culture. We are coming to a close. I want you to be able to have a close as we transition to our next artist.
Of course. Let me just copy the link for both of the pieces I was going to introduce to you guys. And there's another piece that relates to the 9/11 attack in US. I find it's really interesting, called 2. So I'll leave you guys to explore that by yourself. And thank you for coming for my session. I wish I had more time to talk about my topic since I have a lot to say, but still, thank you for coming.
To be continued.